Hello, everybody. You're all very welcome to another programme with us with the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum and Social Rights Ireland. And this week we are joined by Comrade Tommy McKerney of the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. And he has very kindly agreed to speak to us about the man himself, Peadar O'Donnell. Many attendees have come to this programme, and in particular, newcomers have asked, God, who was Peadar O'Donnell? And I don't know much about him. And doesn't that in itself tell you an awful lot about how history is written and who gets written into the history books, especially the school books, and who gets left out? And we're very lucky to be in the company of Tommy and others who know so much about Peadar O'Donnell to have the privilege of this history lesson, Tommy. So go right.
Thank you, Roisin. That's a very generous introduction. Peadar O'Donnell was one of the most celebrated radical revolutionary left-wing people in Ireland of the 20th century. He was known throughout Ireland, feared in fact by the establishment, but also well known in circles abroad in the United States and Europe as a radical left-wing socialist. Peadar O'Donnell was born in County Donegal, Dunlow in 1893. He was one of 13 children, large family. His mother worked in a local co-op. But at the time, the west of Ireland was very poor. People had little to go on, and he experienced from his childhood the hardships of rural life in the west of Ireland. He inherited from his mother the radical tradition of labour, and also his uncle Peter, who was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, who lived in Butte, Montana, worked in Butte, Montana. The Industrial Workers of the World were better known maybe as the Wobblies, famous fighting trade union in the United States. In spite of the fact that he was reared in a difficult economic circumstances, he was a man of very considerable intellectual capabilities. So in 1911, he won a scholarship to St. Patrick's Teacher Training College in Drumcondra in Dublin. Now, to win a scholarship at that time was an enormous achievement for a young man, especially from a rural background, from a country place. At the time, scholarships would have been quite scarce, about 4 or 5 perhaps at most, in County Donegal awarded. So to the fact that Peadar O'Donnell was capable of winning a scholarship to a training college in Dublin indicates the man was gifted intellectually and academically, and obviously had a capability of hard work to do so. Now, within 2 years, he was back in County Donegal in the Rosses, teaching in Innisfree Island. He taught after that. He was 2 years later, in 1915, he was promoted to the head principal in Derryhenny National School near Dunlow. A year later, he was promoted to the principal of Arranmore Island National School. So it's indicative of the man's ability and his talent that he was promoted twice in 3 years, both times to well-connected positions. In 1918, 2 years later, he travelled to Scotland to help organise the Scottish Farm Servants Union. This was another milestone in Peadar's development, where he met with a very influential Willie Gallagher, who later became a member of Parliament for the Communist Party, one of the very few members of the Communist Party of Britain ever elected to the House of Commons. But along with Willie Gallagher and being influenced by the teachings and the speeches of Willie Gallagher, he also would have become familiar with the workings of a trade union in Scotland, particularly with the Scottish farm neighbours, many of whom he had came from Donegal, in what was known as tatty hooking, or gathering the potatoes for wealthy farmers. In the same year, September of 1918, Peadar, he left teaching to become a full-time organiser with the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. At the time, that was quite a sacrifice, because as a principal teacher in a school, he would have been well respected. He would have never become wealthy, but certainly would have had a steady income and a pensionable position. But he gave that up to become a full-time organiser with the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, the ITGWU, the union of Jim Larkin and James Connolly. Before very long, he showed his ability to organise in 1919, 1 year later, when he set up what became known as the Monaghan Soviet. This was the Monaghan, what was called at the time, the Monaghan District Lunatic Asylum. Now, that's a term that we wouldn't obviously dream of using today. At the time, it was known as the Lunatic Asylum, Monaghan District Lunatic Asylum. Now, at the time, the workers were poorly paid, very bad terms and conditions, and also the female employees were discriminated against in several ways, but particularly in their pay. Their pay was much less than those of their male colleagues. But unlike other industrial actions at the time, Peadar, instead of calling everybody out on strike, he insisted they would take over the building, take over the asylum, and he set up a Soviet and put up a red flag and declared him premises a Soviet, which he then was actually appointed himself the CEO of Monaghan District Lunatic Asylum, and proceeded to administer the asylum with the consent of the staff who worked with him. And this was an enormous threat to the establishment at the time. The building was surrounded by the RIC and their army support, but Peadar O'Donnell and his union members resisted, and at one stage, in case that the building would be stormed by the RIC, Peadar instructed the employees, his union colleagues, to dress themselves in the uniforms of the patients at the time, and this eventually proved a success in terms of the management of the asylum. Decided to negotiate with O'Donnell, and they reached a very acceptable settlement for the time, which notably not only improved the pay and conditions for the workers, but significantly allowed the female staff to achieve equal pay with their male colleagues. Now, as time went by and years went by, of course, the management really rolled back on that, but for the time being, it was a tremendous progressive development. Significantly, at the time, because Monaghan Asylum employed a large number of local Protestant people and members actually of the Orange Order, this was something of significance in terms of Peadar's outlook and its development, and also something very unique, maybe in many ways, for the time, that the Orange Order members who saw themselves as members of the working class and backed a strike. And on the basis of that, a few months later, Peadar moved to Caledon in County Tyrone to organise a strike in Caledon as a member of the IT and GWU. Caledon in County Tyrone at the time was home to several factory mills producing uniforms for the British Army. Throughout the war years, 1914 to 18, in the First World War, there had been a huge amount of work for the local population. Pay was decent, and conditions were reasonably good in terms of employment for the time. Now, as the war ended and the British Army no longer required the same amount of uniforms or clothing, management in the Caledon mills decided that they would make a number of people redundant without any redundancy payment, of course, and also that they would reduce the pay packets, which was the reason for the strike. Now, keep in mind that Caledon was also what would be now described as a unionist or a Protestant village, but a majority of the workforce came from the Protestant local Protestant tradition, although there was obviously a number of Catholic people employed in the premises as well. But strikingly, during the strike, Peadar was leading a parade through Caledon village, small village in County Tyrone, and he was leading the parade of workers, which was also led by the local Orange band. And eventually, he eventually the management came to come up with a solution to the strike, which was typical of the perception at the time from the Orange establishment. They offered to end the strike on the condition that the Catholic employees would not be taken back, that there would be only the Protestant employees would be taken back with a small increase in pay. Now the thing is that up to 30 or to 40% of the Protestant workers eligible for re-employment refused to accept this, refused to go back in solidarity with their Catholic colleagues, and were forced to have to actually lose their employment. And many of them went to Scotland, emigrated with their families to Scotland to find employment. Significantly, at the time, a few years later, Peadar was imprisoned, interned in the Curragh as a result of the Civil War. He had taken anti-treaty side, but he was delighted to receive a communication from his old Union friends in Scotland, who sent him a message, a large card with all their signatures, offering him their support and solidarity and wishing him all the best, which was quite a significant development. That was Caledon. Caledon has since achieved a certain mark. At Caledon was a village where in 1968 a housing issue developed as a result of Dungannon District Council awarding a house to a local unionist girl, a single girl, 18 or 19 years of age, a single woman with no family, in preference to a local Catholic family which had been on the waiting list for a house for several years. So, as a result of the takeover, the local civil rights community decided to occupy the house, which they occupied in protest at the action of the local council, which led to a fairly violent eviction, notably by the fact that the local MP at the time, a man called Austin Curry, was party to it as well, and he was seen to be physically ejected from the building, which led to the first civil rights march in the north in August of 1968, a few weeks later, from Dungannon to Killeisland. So Caledon has experienced different events through its history. But shortly after leaving Caledon, Peadar then, in 1919, the same year, he joined the IRA in County Monaghan, although he didn't actually operate as an IRA person in County Monaghan. In 1920, he resigned from the ATNGW to go full-time operational with the IRA. And in 1920, the same year, he became the leader of a flying column in West Donegal, which he led the flying column until May of 1921, just before the treaty, or before the ceasefire. Now, according to reputation, Peadar was a fine activist, leader of the column, but at the same time, the leadership in Dublin and found him difficult to deal with. He was self-opinionated. He was a man that was not easily led astray, but he had his own opinions. So at times they found it difficult to deal with Peadar. But in 1922, he opposed the treaty, and as such was appointed a member of the anti-treaty IRA executive. He was party to the occupation of the Four Courts, and in June of 1922, the Four Courts were attacked by the Free State Army, shelled with weaponry supplied by the British Army. So after the Four Courts was shelled and captured by the Free State Army, he was taken prisoner and for months was lodged in the cell with Liam Mellows. Liam Mellows executed on the 8th of December 1922 along with three of his comrades. Liam Mellows, while he was in the cell with Peadar, he wrote a book, Notes from Mountjoy, and he was largely, as said, influenced by Peadar's political outlook. Notes from Mountjoy become very famous in terms of its, well, first not its author, but it's also his radical, Liam Mellows' radical interpretation of the struggle when he viewed the lack of a radical base for a Republican struggle to win over a majority of the proletariat in Dublin and other larger cities in Ireland, which became a document that was quoted many times in the decades afterwards by the left and Republican left. After his arrest, he spent the next 2 years in various prisons and internment camps. Actually, in 1923, in August of that year, he won a seat in Donegal in the general election called after the end of what's known as the Civil War. But he was still in prison at the time. And in late 1923, he actually went on hunger strike for 41 days, demanding better conditions and actually possibly release as well. In March of 1924, he escaped from the Curragh dressed as a Free State Army soldier. Shortly after being freed or having escaped from the Curragh, in June of that year, he married Peadar O'Donnell, a Cumnamána activist, a radical, and a member of the Communist Party. So again, his influence was supported by the politics of his wife. After the end of the imprisonment period through the Civil War, he edited An Phoblacht from 1926 to 1929. An Phoblacht was effectively the newspaper then of the IRA, and he used his editorship to attempt to divert the IRA from basic simplistic militarism to acquire a socialist-based agitational policy. Now, to an extent, he was reasonably successful in terms of promoting the concept. He won over a goodly number of members of the IRA, but he still didn't win a majority. But his editorship allowed for a radical perception to emerge, and moreover, through those years, the IRA were seen to be quite closely aligned with the Third International, the International Comintern. Through those years, the IRA was seen to be, as a result of his editorship, to be aligned with the Comintern. In the late 1920s and early 30s, he started several campaigns, one of which was a campaign by the small farmers against the payment of land annuities to the British government. Land annuities to the British government was actually almost by way of a mortgage towards the end of the 19th century, and in order to appease the Irish farming peasantry community, the British allowed land to be sold to the peasantry, small amounts of land to the peasantry and demanded a payment of about 100 years. They would pay back over 100 years by way almost of a 100-year mortgage. Now, by the 1930s, Peadar O'Donnell was arguing, late 20s and early 30s, that there was absolutely no justification for having to pay the British government for land that had been stolen from the Irish peasantry, Irish people in the first place. and he argued against this, called a freeze on the land annuities, and this became a mass movement in rural Ireland. Now, it was adopted by Fianna Fáil, and it contributed to their electoral success in 1932. So this was one of the successful moves, agitational moves that Peadar O'Donnell instigated. However, by 1934, he was party to forming the Republican Congress. This was as a result of tension between the IRA's left wing and the leadership. The leadership wanted to concentrate purely on military affairs, believed that political engagement was detracting from their military strategy. And O'Donnell, Frank Ryan, and George Gilmer helped lead a breakaway following an IRA convention which refused to endorse the left-wing politics, policies and desires of Peadar O'Donnell, Ryan and Gilmer. Established the Republican Congress, which has been one of the, if you like, important seminal moments in Republican history in Ireland. Now, it wasn't successful. It didn't last for very long. There was a split almost immediately when a number of those within the Republican Congress argued in favour of turning the Congress into a political party. O'Donnell, Frank Ryan, and others decided no, they wanted to have the Republican Congress as a broader based movement, arguing that it was essential to win it to achieve the Republic, rather than necessarily to depend purely on a socialist state first. That they took the view that it was necessary to break the treaty, the Dominion status, but it effectively weakened the Republican Congress. But by 1936, he was travelling in Spain when Franco launched the coup. O'Donnell left Spain, but worked assiduously thereafter to help to defend the Spanish Republic, and argued strongly for its defence and helped recruit for the international brigades that went to Spain, led from Ireland by Frank Ryan, who fought in Spain on behalf of the Spanish Republic with the Irish contingent who defended the Spanish Republic. Through the 1930s, the 40s, 50s and 60s, Peadar helped forge different links between Irish Republicans and the revolutionary left, both in Ireland and internationally. He was, for his efforts on behalf of the left and revolutionary left in Ireland and abroad, he was banned from entering into the United States, which in many ways I suppose is a mark of credit to anybody. But he represented the Irish left in many platforms in continental Europe, organised at meetings and rallies and whatnot, and was well known throughout the left and well respected even by the Comintern in Moscow, centred in Moscow. He was someone who forever, for all his life, was a supporter of anti-imperialism. In the early 1960s, he was the president of the Irish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He led protests against the Vietnam War. He was a strong supporter of African anti-colonial movements, and he was a strong campaigner against apartheid in South Africa. Effectively, every anti-imperialist campaign at the time Peadar supported and was a leading advocate of, and very often the fact that he was present in a campaign enhanced the campaign, encouraged others to join that campaign, which was always an asset. He continued to support radical campaigns right up to his death on the 13th of May 1986, aged 93. Peadar, due to his views, perhaps probably influenced by the fact that he had saw the Protestant people supporting the Monaghan Soviet, the support he received from the Protestant people, workers in Culloden, and also the fact that in 1934, the Republican Congress led a procession to join the Bodenstown commemoration, which included a number of people from the Shankill Road who came carrying a banner, break the connection with capitalism. It was prevented from marching by members of the IRA at the time, but on that basis, I'm sure it influenced Peadar's views of what was happening in the 1970s after 69-70 in the North. He didn't support the armed campaign of the Provisionals, but as he was elderly at the time, I'm not saying his age influenced him because he had his own view, but that was Peadar's view. He remained a radical right until the end. He was not only a radical activist, but he was also a very gifted writer and influential in literary circles in Ireland through those years. He wrote a number of books, fiction books and non-fiction. In 1925, he had published a book called The Storm, 1928 a book called The Islanders, 1929 called Agricul, 1930 a book called The Knife, 1934 On the Edge of the Stream, and 1954 a book called The Big Windows, which became well known. Perhaps it was his books of non-fiction that became best known. In 1932, he wrote a book called The Gates Flew Open, which was actually about the release from prison after the Civil War. 1936, a book called Salud, an Irishman in Spain, which, as the name suggests, he was speaking of the outbreak of the Civil War in Spain, or the Franco's coup, and he published that book to explain what was happening. And then in 1963, he published another book which read There Will Be Another Day by Lie Alone, another famous book. Moreover, his contribution in the literary circles wasn't confined to his authorship of books, but he was a founder of The Bell, with a literary magazine of the left, along with the writer Sean O'Whelan, and he founded The Bell in 1940 and edited it from 1946 until it ceased publication in 1954. The Bell was very influential in terms of its contribution to not only left-wing politics in Ireland, but it gave an opening to many writers who become well-known writers in later years, who were first introduced to the public through The Bell. It was Peadar O'Donnell's contribution. He has, unfortunately, in some ways been ignored, obviously because of his radical outlook, his revolutionary contribution, but he remains one of the primary principal radicals of the 20th century in Ireland, a genius and a giant of the left, and his legacy will not be easily dismissed.
Tommy, absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much for giving us a very comprehensive overview and yet concise enough to pack 93 years of a wonderful revolutionary man into half an hour there. So we really value that history lesson, and we're now also going to continue the conversation with actually some people who remember the man and who encountered the man himself. So thanks very much, Tommy, and we'll just end this segment now. Thank you.
Thank you, Roisin. Thank you for the opportunity.
The beginning of of Tommy's talk, a good view in terms of pattern activity. I don't know, did you mention Tommy talking about anecdotes, Peadar's attendance at an Orange Lodge meeting many moons ago? He did a great. Peadar was a great writer and a great storyteller on top of the politics. So maybe if you want a few anecdotes, Roisin, so we'll see what we can do with that. He gave a talk once many years ago to the South Central branch in Dublin of the Conley Youth Movement. And Peadar came along, we asked him to give a talk on the Orange Order, and he turned up with an orange sash, which he had been presented, to him by, I think it was the chair of the local Orange Lodge somewhere up in Donegal, by one of these peculiar stories that only Peadar can get himself involved in. They became great friends. And your man invited Peadar to come along to a meeting of his local lodge, incognito, obviously. So Peadar sat at this meeting at the Orange Lodge, listened to the local lodge men getting up and denouncing this notorious Fenian bastard, Peadar O'Donnell, who was the leading IRA figure in Donegal at the time. So that was a classic Peadar story. He loved to tell stories with himself at the middle of it. Where sitting there, listening to himself being denounced by the Orange men, and then he turns up 50 years later, a Conley Youth Movement meeting with showing us the sash. A fantastic experience. The other one was a famous one, I suppose, again, anecdotes, when he was denouncing De Valera over the level of unemployment, I think in the late 40s, 1950s. And De Valera, who of course knew him back in their time together in the IRA, and De Valera rang him and said, Peadar, you've been very unfair. If you were in charge, there's still have been 1 million people living in the country. And Peadar said there might have been, but there'd be a different million people. So again, he was never short of he had a high opinion of himself, and deservedly so. He was a small man, but he had a high opinion of himself. I remember Jamie Groughton, that film recently was made about Jimmy's Hall, about James Groughton, who was deported by De Valera and very active subsequently in the Communist Party in New York for many years. Groughton was not very keen on Peadar, and he said to Peadar, he said he wants to be the groom at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral, so Peadar had an ego, but it was deserved. I don't know, Tommy, did you cover the thing about the talking about Caledon when we had the meeting at the forum there a few years back? At the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum in Caledon. And there was a local there who was the guy showing us around the old mills. And he invited him, obviously, to sit in on the talks that were given. I think Fergal McCluskey was one of the main speakers that day. I can't remember the other speakers. But Fergal was talking about what Tommy just mentioned there, the history back in 1798 and what the United Irishmen in the area. And this lad who was into local tourism and local history, giving us a guide to the mills, he didn't know anything about this. He'd never heard about that, and he'd never heard about Peadar O'Donnell and the activities that took place there. Just literally written out with history by the local unionists, politics. But I said Peadar was fully armed, full of anecdotes. One of the last things that was published on him, which is great, was based on when Ronald Reagan, the reactionary president of the United States, visited Ireland. He was conferred with some literary honours, doctor of whatever, by University College Galway. And the local academic staff there were highly indignant about this, foremost of which was a fellow called Michael D. Higgins, who was the lecturer in the college at the time. So they organised an alternative conferring on Peadar O'Donnell and elected him the honorary chancellor of the university. Peadar gave a talk on that occasion called Monkeys in the Superstructure. And he talked about Dáil Éireann and the goings on there. That was just a superstructure. That's not what real power lay. So he says, when you're looking at the politicians in Dáil Éireann, he says it's just like a collection of monkeys playing in the superstructure. But you need to get into the base, the fundamentals of class control and of capitalism if you want to change things and not be spend your time worrying about the monkeys in the superstructure. That's just a few weeks' stories. I leave it at that. But by the way, if anybody can get their hands on that pamphlet, Monkeys in the Superstructure. It was Peadar reminiscing over his time in politics, and an introduction by Michael D. Higgins, which was equally good. It's well worth getting your hands on. If not, maybe we should try to reprint it. It's worth reading for another generation.
Absolutely, Eddie. Great to hear those wee stories, and also it's how you tell them, Eddie. Lovely way of reminiscing. And while you were speaking, Eddie, I was just looking at Owen Harris there, and I thought, Jesus, is that a sash that he has round him? He looks like an orange man.
It depends which Owen Harris you're talking about.
Well, there's one in the room here, but he's not the bad one. But well, then he is wearing an orange sash, so it's hard to tell these days.
Well, I'm sure it's not the Owen Harris that started off being a key ideologist of the Stickies and turned them into a quasi-unionist organisation before he jumped.
I don't think it's the same boy.
Gale and subsequently David Trimble.
No, it's not. Thankfully, no. But yeah, well, Owen, you can speak for yourself in a wee while, maybe, and verify your identity. Bill, I'm going to go over to Bill now. It's great to see you here because I think, Bill, you also met Peadar O'Donnell in person, and you're up in Donegal too. Are you there tonight, Bill? You're in Donegal.
I'm in Donegal tonight.
Culture Road.
Culture Road. Yeah, I met him more than once. I met him in Dublin when his friend Packy Ailey, he was in the member of the Communist Party. Now, Peadar was never in the Communist Party, and he had severe reservations about them, which he went into with me. Now, also, he was after getting central heating in his house, and he had open fireplaces in all his bedrooms, and subsequently the heat would have went just up the chimney. So I had to build these things up, which would have taken about a week. But Peadar wouldn't let me do the work. Every time I started and doing a bit, we'll go over to the Skylon. See, Peadar had an accountant at Skylon after the wife died, and he had his breakfast, dinner and tea in the Skylon, and he paid for it. Now, we never drank. He hated drink because his father, who was an excellent fiddler, and in Donegal, if you're an excellent fiddler, you have to be a genius of a fiddler because there's fierce competition about fiddling in Donegal. And he used to have to bring him home from all these social events, and he'd be drunk, most likely on poteen. And he felt it was degrading and he didn't like it, so he stayed out drink himself. Now, he got his politics off his mother, which I think Tommy McCartney went into, because his uncle, her brother, was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World in America, and used to send over all the literature and one thing and another, and visited Donegal in some of the summits, and discussions took place there, and that's how we got his politics. Now, this thing about living in poverty, you have to compare the poverty in the rural Ireland and urban Ireland at the time, and you'll find that the poverty in rural Ireland was an awful lot less than the poverty in urban Ireland, the most extreme poverty, that is. Now, his father was an excellent farmer, and he had to be because the land he lived on, and if you see where his home place is a place called Mina Moor, not far from where Eddie Slacken lives now, and it's on the road between Buttonport and going up to Greendower. It's only rock. But he used to make soil by going to the beaches and getting seaweed and one thing and another. And he was able to. They were able to live. They had food. They never needed. They never needed money, and things like that. Now, Peadar, that's the kind of he had an idyllic childhood in a bilingual area, and then he had progressive politics in his home with his mother and things like that. So he had a very good background. Now, also, I was involved with him in the cooperatives in Glencolmkill, where I live in now. And this is a book that he wrote, which I was looking to get a copy of it because it's got out of print. There was an organisation that he set up called DOCUS. Now, those of you who have Irish know that DOCUS means hope. And the DOCUS Cooperative Society produced this book when he was very, very keen on the rural populations and how they were being decimated with immigration. And there was no need for it. And he worked with this priest, Peadar. That was the parish. Well, he was a curate there. Ended up in the parish priest eventually. And he was amalgamating the small farms, which were totally non-viable entities, and trying to get them to turn them into viable entities. Now, he had a lot of success in that. He got help by some of the progressives in the Department of Agriculture. So he got opposition from others in the Department of Agriculture. And now this, I just finished reading it again today. I read it years ago, but I read it again before I come onto this program. And he deals with it. But he was afraid, what he recognised was McLaren had been cured in London during the Blitz. And an awful lot of the Irish went over there and worked in munitions factories and one thing and another, and during the war. And he thought that if they were able to find any kind of a half living in Ireland, it would be equal to what they would have to learn in London, because they didn't have as much overheads like rent, transport, and all that. And at the time, the farms were still, people were still living and subsistence farming. Like, they don't even grow potatoes in Glencolmkill these days. I actually seen Israeli potatoes been sold in the local shop, which absolutely disgusted me. Now, when I came here first, which was, I was sent here by the Republican movement. A few of us were for to help Peadar and to put water in houses, and then to build a holiday village for the expand tourism, and it did. And now, how it fell down was Peadar overstretched himself, and when the recession came, he wasn't able to repay the payments to the bank, and the banks closed in and took everything except the folk village. The folk village in Glencolmkill is still it's the last of the co-ops. They're still alive, but he had 14 co-ops going. They had vegetable co-ops. They had co-ops for iron sweaters, where women could knit iron sweaters and sell them through the co-op and get premium prices for them in really fancy shops in New York and things like that. And then they generators. He got electricity into the area, because the government was trying to actually let the place die, because it was only a nuisance for them. But Peadar wasn't around that, and neither was O'Donnell. O'Donnell was very, very keen on the situation in Northern Ireland, and he didn't want them to. He knew that the population was getting depopulated. There's no question about that. Now, I remember asking Peadar, they're calling you the left hand of God. How does the Catholic hierarchy agree with that? He says, I told them that they wouldn't get peace if they allowed the families in Northern Ireland die, and that they took it to heart. So therefore, they started giving me support. So they, the Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? So in any event, O'Donnell, in his books, he deals with rural economics. Like Islanders is when he was teaching on a small island called Innisquare. That's the island of sheep. He was a school teacher there, and there's a YouTube video of him in his late 80s when he visited it again. It had to be it had to be evacuated. The island had, because in 1934, in the mid 30s, there was a big tidal wave came in and covered the whole island. Uh, and only there was one two-story building on the island. The people would have all drowned, so they couldn't risk that again. So they took them off the island. Now, there was no such thing as private property on that island, and he deals with that in YouTube. And that's what he wanted in Columkill. He was saying that it was the breaking up of the land into small piecemeal pieces that made the whole thing unviable. That they had to get some kind of collective and work the land on an industrial basis, and that's what he was into. So he's very
Thank you,
focused.
Bill. Yeah, thanks. No, thanks. I get the impression there's a few people here could keep going all night and telling us stories, which is actually great because this is like living history as well. It's very important that this is recorded, and particularly by those, who knew him personally and who were deeply influenced by him. So I'm just going to go. I know that Eddie, Barry, Patricia, Tommy, Garrod, you're, founding members of the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. Maybe I'll go to you first, Tommy, and ask, like, when it came to naming or choosing a name for this organization, was there any question about, was it who made the decision, or why Peadar O'Donnell? And were you personally influenced by Peadar O'Donnell, as a youngster?
Not so much as a child, but as in my 20s, I became aware of Peadar O'Donnell and the Republican Congress. And 1986, in the year of Peadar's death, I helped form a magazine called Congress 86, which was advocating a departure from Republican militarism into anti-imperialist, Labour-led politics. But the foundation of the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum was the inspiration of the late Tom Redmond. I have to be careful here that I have to be careful not to say, misquote the man, because he's no longer with us, but he's a really inspiring figure, Tom Redmond. Eddie would have known him, was a close comrade for many years. Tom Redmond, if I can remember rightly how he put it, was his father had been a member of the Republican Congress in the 1930s. And Tom's father always said that he believed that maybe the Congress had split too early, that it should have had taken a little bit more time to split away from the IRA. It should have taken a little bit more time. But having said that, Tom was the inspiration behind the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. And several meetings which took place between myself and Tom and our comrades in Dublin, Eugene McCartan, Eddie here, in Connolly Books, until we eventually decided upon forming what we call the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum, with the objective, as is outlined in its forming foundational charter, to engage in dialogue with the left and between the left and Republicans in an attempt to bring the Republican position closer to a left-wing position. That was the foundation of it.
Thanks, Tommy. Good to know that as well, and for those in attendance tonight who've been coming for months now. Like I see some familiar faces, Dorothy, there as well. I see you writing down, taking notes furiously, Dorothy, as well. I am too. I know this is recorded and we can go back over it, but it is, I think, when you write something down, you're more inclined to remember it or speak about it more confidently in future. Thanks very much. I'm going to open it up now, maybe before we move to the next section and talk about, how the politics of Peadar O'Donnell remains relevant and can be applied to today's situation. But if anybody would like to have a question for Tommy or for Eddie, Bill, who met Peadar, go ahead. George, you've unmuted. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, just really a question more or less directed to Bill. You know, as a Drumcondra man, I mean, I knew about Peadar O'Donnell. I mean, interesting that Bill was saying they used to go over to the Skyline. I knew he lived on Drumcondra Road, so it must have been a little bit up from the Skyline. But I think I was too young. I think he'd moved over to Milltown, I think. By the time I kind of got out and about, you know, certainly on the main roads. But one question is, I know from reading about Peadar that he was very connected with Ernie O'Malley, and Ernie O'Malley is a real, for Republicans in Drumcondra, as I was growing up and getting active, you know, Ernie O'Malley was a kind of, he lived in Drumcondra, but it was just kind of the place called Iona, but it was classified as Drumcondra. We claimed him anyway. But I think Ernie for a while, Tommy mentioned the Bell magazine. So I know Ernie, I think, was also an editor of that. And as far as I can see, they were fairly close together, you know. I mean, both of them, for us, you know, lots of people talk about the Civil War. But I mean, the first we heard from Ernie O'Malley, when I read him, you know, he didn't describe it as a civil war. It was basically a fight against the British imperialism. And, you know, in that sense, it was continuing the revolution. It was fighting the counter-revolution. I think Peadar O'Donnell had the same kind of view, so they're very connected that way. But I just wondered, Bill, did you ever know of him and how close he was to Ernie O'Malley?
No, he never spoke about Ernie O'Malley to me. But one of the things that when I was in the house, the bell rang one day, and he asked me to answer the door. And when I answered the door, it was Sean Lemaster was standing at the door. And I'd never met him before, and he was after being the teacher. And I nearly fell out of his stand, and I said, Jesus. And then Peadar said, yeah, he's an old friend. So we were in the folk house together and all that. And we go over to the Skyline and we drink tea and biscuits. Yeah, all right. And then when we were there, he said, you know, Sean Lemaster used to give the lectures in Marxism to the folk house garrison. So I thought, bloody hell, you know. But it was a great education to be even with him, you know. It was better than money, but he paid you anyway, you know.
Yeah, it's a great education, Bill, to be in the company of revolutionaries. It really is. And I hope that all those in attendance tonight and who are watching this, you know, like this is a live program. And look how many brilliant revolutionaries we are sitting with tonight. You know, it's just quite incredible. It's remarkable, and we want to acknowledge and thank our living revolutionaries, because too often these people become legends and in death. So in life, we must celebrate our mentors, and they are very patient mentors. Barry, Tommy, you know, every day. It's great to have you in text to be able to run through pass through you and to get that advice. It's always level-headed, and the patience that you have for the like of me as well. So thank you. Anybody else maybe have a question or a comment for our experts?
I think it's important that we speak about the effects of the Peadar O'Donnell legacy today as well, and especially within Republican circles. Tommy mentioned there about the Congress 86 in the jail. That had a big effect in the jail. I was in the jail after Tommy left, and the effects of it were still there, and it was still discussed. A brother of mine, Marcus, now deceased, was part of that Congress 86 with Tommy, among others. There was great debates around the position that Tommy took, the sort of liberal position then that the rest of the leadership within the jail took, and there was contention all the time about it. There was friction. Still today, there's friction to a greater or lesser extent, probably through misunderstanding as well, with a lot of people within the Republican circles. And there's a lot of very good Republicans out there, people who are not afraid to confront the system, but sadly, they don't have the insights all the time that Peadar had. And I think that's a pity. And it's something that the Peadar O'Donnell Forum would strive to change in any way that we can. And I think that's a very important project. It's a very important part of struggle, that we are able to effectively get the fighting force of Ireland, which is effectively the Republicans has been. Now, not always well directed, not always maybe in the fullest revolutionary sense. In fact, a lot of time it wasn't. But at least Republicans were prepared to, as is clear from Irish history, were prepared to confront even the hopeless situations. But sadly, too often they were lacking in a revolutionary understanding of what it would take to actually take power in Ireland. And I think that that's probably one of the greatest failures within the thinking of not only Republican activists, but other activists as well, that they don't start off from the position that, we want to take power in Ireland. Now, I don't mean that in any kind of sort of bravado way. I think that has to be a tactical thinking way, that's the position that we're starting off from, and that's the position we need to build for and build around. I think Peadar O'Donnell clearly had the same idea, because he was keen to set up cooperatives to get people politically educated. As Bill pointed out, they were never great economic enterprises. They were never going to make millions. But what they made in people understanding what it took to work together as a community, and also to become politicized, that's the important thing about it. And it was clear that Peadar had the ability to bring people from clearly opposite views, like people from the Orange Order and whatever, to bring them to a position of understanding that we're in this struggle together as the working class and the majority in Ireland. That's still the position. I mean, his position is as relevant today as it was then. And I think it's something that the Peadar O'Donnell Forum really needs to sort of start to work on even harder than we already do, if we can. We're maybe not just as able and fit as we used to be, but there's a lot of stuff that can still be done. I think that's education in particular is a very important part of all of that.
Absolutely, Barry. It's the educate, especially those who are dying to learn, who are willing to learn and who are ready to listen, because for so long, many of us were going round in circles. And now we have this sense of clarity, which is half the battle. Eddie, come in, please. Go right.
Yeah, I think Barry has pointed very well to the type of issues, I suppose, that we need to be addressing. I think in relation, we were trying to fix Peadar O'Donnell in his political and historical context. He was very much in the Connolly tradition, just recognising that the national and the social questions were not separate, but they were linked and part of the same struggle against imperialism and ultimately against capitalism. And that was why, as a union organizer, and I think Bill was quite right, he got his politics, but as a union organizer, he was rooted in the working class, and that was very much manifested in his work as an organizer. The relatively short period of time he was a union organizer, both in Caledon and in the famous occupation of the asylum in Monaghan, which is something that somebody should make a film about. That it's a brilliant story. But that idea of the Connolly approach of the linking together and the inability to separate the national and the social questions. Peadar spent all his time, he's talking about as an IRA leader, he came to the conclusions himself, like the influence he had, for example, in Lee Mellos and his notes from Mount Chai, and that's where he saw the importance and centrality of mobilising the working class. And the great weakness and failure of the national revolution ultimately was that the working class were not engaged and were not involved. And that became I suppose the key thing for Peadar through his political life was the understanding that you had to be involved. And I think this way I come back to Barry's point. You have to be involved in the day-to-day struggles of working people. You can't stand outside of the working class that you claim to represent and say, we'll do this, that, and the other. You need to be engaged with the class and in their day-to-day struggles. And that was central to Peadar. That was why in the late 1920s, when they saw militarily the Republic had been defeated, and there had to be a new way for the movement to find relevance and to engage with the people. And that was where the concept of the Republican Congress came from. Now, Thomas have spoken to the split. There was 2 splits, actually, I think, in the first few months. It didn't last, pardon the expression, pissing time, the Republican Congress. But, I mean, that was the idea behind it, to try to unite radical Republicans and Socialists to build a movement based on the working class and small farmers. And that was Peadar's approach all throughout his life, whether it was Catholic workers, Protestant workers, whether it was urban workers or rural workers. The key thing in Peadar was to be involved with and engage with and provide leadership for the struggles and conflicts of the working class. And I mean, that was where his position, Tommy mentioned that Peadar was very opposed to the military campaign in the 70s and 80s. But that was coming from the same position that he had in the 1930s, when they brought workers from the Shankill Road town to march in Bodenstown, and they were beaten over by the Republicans, saying break the connection with capitalism. I mean, that was very much his thinking as well in relation to the military campaign in the 70s and 80s, that he saw it as contributing, whatever the intentions of the participants, contributing to divisiveness, again, within the North. And that was something that he had heard. He felt that unless there was a united working class, united on militant social policies, and this has been his hallmark all the way through the 20s, not trying to get the Republic movement to adopt the social programs, which the leadership said, oh no, that's just politics, nothing to do with us. But I mean, that was Peadar's hallmark all through his life, was unification of working people, the understanding, trying to build a movement around that. I think that's still very much the challenge that we have to face. I mean, looking at what was happening over the last couple of weeks there with the contractors and the farmers and all the rest of massive blockades and demonstrations, and massive support for that, but not very, perhaps maybe not really understanding what many of the issues at the root of it were. But again, you say, well, where was the working class and where was the labour movement in that process? The General Secretary of the ICTU belatedly came onto the radio yesterday and started talking, well, what about us and the 600,000 members of the trade union movement in the 26 counties? But I mean, the labour movement should have been to the fore in these processes about the cost of living. It should be mobilising the trade union movement. For example, May Day is coming up. There's a perfect opportunity for the trade union movement to give a bit of political leadership, to mobilise the working class, to fight for their own interests rather than everybody else's. So, sorry, I'm straight off, but was following on from what Barry was saying about identifying what are the issues and how the forces that need to be mobilised. They're the same as ever. Get the working people together around a radical programme that addresses imperialism and native capitalism. Peadar O'Donnell was never behind the door when it came to dealing with local capitalists. You can have all the performative speeches that you want about imperialism, but you need to start looking at the local convening capitalist class as well here, which is the social base for imperialism in this country. But I think that's something that any of us to have any involvement or say in the trade union movement, we should be pushing that movement now to start stepping forward on behalf of the working class.
Thank you, Eddie. Absolutely. And I think that's where we need to veer the conversation now, because I'm conscious of the time. And I know that there are people here who were active on the streets around towns and in Dublin over the last 7 days. It would be great to hear from them. But Bill, you've your hand up. Do you want to just come in there quickly, Bill, before we move it along?
One of the things that Peadar was disappointed with in his life was that urban Ireland did not understand rural Ireland. and he had a vision of rural Ireland that was different, and he could never sell it to urban Ireland. Now, if you read his books, he deals with it. He even deals with it in Salou, where he praises the anarchists in Catalonia for the way they organised their farms and their market system. And they have a kind of collective, all peculiar to their own area and their own district. And that's the sort of things like people say I've heard people condemning O'Donnell for being an anarchist. Well, they were condemning him and they were using his attitude towards the collectivization of land in Spain as an example of why he was an anarchist. But I think he was right in what he was saying. And that's like, he also attended an international small farmers conference in Berlin, where he actually heard Hitler speaking, because the Nazis were only coming off the ground at that time. And someone said Hitler would be speaking today. So we went to have a listen to him. But that was his main disappointment in life, that he couldn't unite the urban ruling class and the urban working class. And that's why he deals with this book. I don't know where to send it to you.
Yeah.
You see, it's a shilling now.
Yeah. Well, if they're out of print, it's even more precious in a way, Bill. Thank you.
It's extremely out, and it's O'Donnell's writing, and it's very in depth, you know. And I was dealing with the co-ops that he tried to set up here in the late 60s with the help of the Republican movement.
Well, look, it would be great, Bill, because we are trying to create, a working class library.
I'll give you a copy of this. I'm going to Dublin next week, and I'll pop it up to you.
Great, thank God, my Albert. Moving along, Owen, I see you here. Just, you might need to stand up to a check. Is that an orange sash you're wearing? But no, we're not sectarian. The lesson that we must learn from O'Donnell is, that we need to talk to all workers. But Owen, you were out on the streets up in Dublin, and we saw a great video of you down at Limerick Port, actually. So can you give us your maybe a quick summary of your experience and even an analysis of maybe why an awful lot of people are very unhappy about, why there's a split view about what's happening in terms of action and all of these accusations flying that it's been organised by the far right. I think we need to talk about that. Go ahead, Owen.
Yeah, well, I suppose that stuff starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy after a while, when enough people believe it and forfeit the whole energy or the whole mobilization that happened when they start to believe all this stuff and just forfeit it to the populist nationalists. Well, then this stuff is going to start to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's very important for all, socialists of all stripes to get out there and put our message out there, well, some of us were down there more than others. I was there Saturday and Sunday, and we seen Saturday. You were down there as well, Roisin. We saw a lot of people. No message, basically no message at all. Just tricolours. We came down. We had our message. We had the starry plough, the tricolour, and we had our sign of Epstein and Trump and Netanyahu, basically, trying to, in a kind of theatre, understand the heart of why everybody's in difficulty here. But you do hear a lot of people saying, who are speaking for the whole thing, and it's a very there's a big mix of class interests here, and it is a bit of a minefield. So you hear people like saying, until this conflict, whatever is going on, until it blows over, we're just asking for a bit of help. And this shows really an unawareness of the whole historical, I suppose, events just happened, and this is no temporary crisis. So you had lots of establishment, left, liberal leaning people saying, this is a far right protest. I even heard one senator say, every time I see right now, I'm terrified. And this kind of attitude, it starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as I already said. So people stay away, and a lot of populist nationalists, they have more support than us. We know from a lot of interactions, there's been a long history of the last 3 or 4 years of them using children to incite violence, all of this, but they're a small contingent. I think unfortunately they have maybe a base of a few hundred following them in Dublin, but I mean, we have to get out there with our message and affect the working class. We all met, strangely, we met a few young lads from one of these parties, one of these populist nationalist parties, and they seemed very intelligent. They definitely weren't lumping kind of elements like the ones we're used to dealing with, or paid agents. I feel like there's a lack. The left have left a lot of young people alienated in the way it's gone in the last few years. And maybe Republican has been a little bit too closed. We see Republican groups a lot of the time are faceless, and this you can kind of understand where it comes from, with state repression, people not wanting to have their identities out there. But I feel like maybe we need to find a better way to make the movement more open, and still kind of be not jeopardize our security at the same time.
Yeah, I myself being down there at the weekend, and some of our comrades down, well, every single day, actually from day one, and it wasn't to check out the situation. It was to bring a message. I mean, there is no point going down there to check out the situation. I mean, you go with your conviction and you stand, and it's a great pity that the Ireland flag, the tricolour, means different things to different people. But even if you bring the starry plough, it is a conversation starter. It allows you to open up a conversation. But we should all have had, all of us, the revolutionary, radical revolutionary, communists, and all of our comrades should have been down there. It's a missed opportunity, actually, to educate. Because, you know, we can turn up here every Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday night and talk to ourselves. But I mean, if we don't get out there and use every opportunity, well, then it's no wonder, like you say, Owen, that the narrative becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the only footage we see is footage of, you know, lumpen or uh, people on the right or whatever, well then, you know, looking at it from home, you would think that it's not our place to be there, but it's absolutely our place to be there. Where else can we be? You know, and we should be out on the streets with a message. Not only, you know, I held up the picture of Epstein, Netanyahu, and Trump there, but we had the big banners, you know, break the chains of Zionism, a conversation starter, and sovereignty for Ireland now, a conversation starter. And it's a message and it has a demand as well, because without our demands, what is the point walking around to scope out the place? You know, we're just bystanders watching things evolve without taking some kind of responsibility and ownership. And you know, it doesn't. You don't need to go down. It doesn't take an army. But also the fear factor thing of like that you're going to get what's the worst that somebody can do? Tell you to leave. But if we act as Peadar O'Donnell acted, well, in good faith, with going there with the intention to talk, to have dignity, to listen, to respect, and not make a judgment before we get down here. These boys are all far right. You know, what a judgmental attitude that is. You're not going to get anywhere if you enter into a space, you know, with that mentality. I don't think, anyway. Stephen, I'd like to bring you in. You're always here every week. You were down the west. I don't know, were you affected in any way, or what was the feeling or the vibe down west?
Hi, Roisin. I don't have all that much to add. I mean, I was down west. It was, I wasn't terribly affected. I was working, so I couldn't take part in the protest. My feeling here was that it was very grassroots. It was a lot of like farmers, um, small hauliers. I spoke to some people I know who work as kind of as bus drivers, and they were saying it was, there was a lot of resentment that the bigger associations, the professional associations, wouldn't get on board because they have like one of the a guy I know who has a coach business in Clare, and he's got 6 or 7 coaches, and he says it's a kind of a limit to be in the, I forget what the name of the association is of coach operators. You have to have a minimum of 13 coaches or something to be in their representative body. So there was definitely a sense it was grassroots, and it was the smaller operators. Now, yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear what Owen was saying about it being a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when people vacate the space, that's who ends up filling it, is the, populist nationalists or right-wing nationalists. I don't know. I think it remains to be seen. It all comes down to how well people are able to join the dots. I mean, what was your experience with bringing along signs related to Epstein and to Zionism? Did people feel that they were out of place? I mean, I saw the image that your Break the Chains of Zionism banner ended up in the Liffey at some point and luckily was rescued. Um, I don't know, I mean, how many of the people are fully able to connect the dots to the broader. I mean, I think the anger with the government is absolutely justified, but for me, it wouldn't be primarily about anger about the amount of excise on fuel, but about the fact that they're complicit in the US empire that has provoked all of this. I don't know if those
Yeah.
if you met many people who were able to have that conversation.
When we got there, there was actually a couple of people. One woman came running over because she recognized us from Shannon. So and she actually said, I'm not involved in any Palestine group at all because there is no class consciousness in any group. She seemed like relieved to see us. She's like, thank God, because everybody says that these people are all anti-Palestine. We're not. She says, maybe we're not, many people are not able to go right back to the root cause. But she says, these are my neighbours, my friends. She says, I have more in common with people standing here today than I have in WhatsApp groups that are marching emptied oil. So it was good to have that conversation, and it was like it's how we feel as well. And I think it's probably why isolation is real. Why break the chains of Zionism was such an anathema to the Palestine Solidarity movement in the early days, in the same way as it was rejected by lumpens and thrown in the Liffey. What's the difference? What's the difference between the IPSC, who had an issue with a message that goes to the heart of imperialism, and the lumpen who doesn't like the Palestinian colours? That tells you something about what they have in common. Sadly, so the Epstein one, I think that appeals to a lot more, who maybe don't understand the nature of, the working class or the ruling class have always been barbaric. There have always been a predatory class. It's not a new thing, but for some reason, that image seems to resonate, and people, really see the disgusting kind of nature. Maybe it's the Epstein thing. Do they see that whether it's Trump or Biden? I don't know. Although many people did comment and said, you need to have Clinton on that, you need to have Biden on that as well. So that's a start. I mean, if you don't engage somewhere, it's very hard for small grassroots organizations to do anything to create big change. But I mean, you do your best. We're not going to create transformative change overnight. But certainly if we're not there, well, then you're handing it on a plate to the populist nationalists. And we must not be afraid, to talk to people who are rightfully angry and pissed off. And even if even if they don't drive a car and the diesel prices don't affect them, they're clearly affected by the cost of living. And really devastating to see many homeless people latching on to it as well. And yet we had one woman come over to me and ask me, seriously, is Social Rights Ireland seriously supporting this protest? And I said, we are. And I said, and are you? And she says, I absolutely am not. And she looked down her nose. So there's something really not right about a lot of, not all of, but this kind of moral superiority, I think, that we're experiencing amongst many, not all, many of the pro-Palestine groups. They need to get over themselves because nobody has a monopoly over a moral standing. This is a political issue, so it is. And if the people who are out marching for Palestine don't know that by now, well then, where are they going? Before I end, I'd like to properly thank Tommy McKerney, our comrade from the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum, for that very important and insightful, I won't say lecture, Tommy, because then that'll make you an academic, and sure we know what we think of them. For a very informative history lesson in a most accessible way for all learners of all levels and abilities. Thank you, Tommy. Barry, I think Frarian would be okay with Tommy's lesson today. Thank you, Barry, for your contributions as ever, showing up always, and for your guidance on a daily basis. Patricia, thank you. Paul, thank you for coming along. And I can't see everybody here. Garrow is here. Niall's just gone. And Eddie, it's class It's class to hear that accent, number one, and just the expertise that comes tripping off the tongue. Please come back, Eddie. It's brilliant to see you. And Bill, lovely to hear that firsthand. Yeah, experience and the encounters that you had. I'm sure you have many more tales to tell. Some of them maybe you can tell us in private. Some tales can be told publicly, but not all. And Owen is ever our comrade in Kerry and Stephen in Galway. Thank you all to all our participants. George for chipping in there with wee anecdotes about Drumcondra. And I see others, Anthony, Dorothy, many more. Thank you for coming. I'm going to end the recording now and we'll see you all back again next week. Goramila Mayagov.